My name is Hannah. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've played roles that looked very stable from the outside. Wife, professional, dependable presence in rooms where decisions were being made by louder people. I've never been the kind of woman who commands attention by raising her voice. I listen, I notice patterns, I take my time before I speak. And because of that, people often mistake me for someone who doesn't see what's happening. Friends used to describe me as low maintenance. Colleagues called me easy to work with. My husband once said I was drama-free, as if that were the highest compliment. What they really meant was that I didn't interrupt the flow of their lives. I didn't demand emotional labor on their schedule. I fit neatly into the background of their narratives. This story isn't about betrayal in the cinematic sense. There are no shocking discoveries made in a single night, no screaming matches, no viral moments. It's about something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. It's about the slow realization that the life you're living has been edited for an audience you never agreed to perform for. The moment when you understand that intimacy has been replaced with optics and presence with perception. At some point, without planning to, I learned something that reframed my entire marriage. I learned my marriage was a performance for social media. Online, we looked connected, coordinated, and aspirational. Offline, we didn't speak. That contrast didn't appear overnight. It accumulated, post by post, silence by silence, until the gap between the two became impossible to ignore. What you're about to hear is not a story of revenge. I didn't set out to expose anyone or reclaim power through humiliation. This is a documentary-style reflection on how quiet people survive environments that benefit from their silence, and what happens when that silence becomes a choice instead of a habit. Over the course of the story, I'll walk you through how I was perceived, how small dismissals normalize themselves, and how roles get assigned without our consent. You'll hear about the internal shift that happens long before any external change is visible, about preparation, which looks like patience, about decisions made without announcements, and about the kind of emotional justice that doesn't need applause to be real. I'm sharing this because I know how isolating it can feel to realize you've been present in someone else's life mainly as a prop. Because many of us are taught that endurance is the same thing as strength, and that silence is the same thing as peace. This story questions that. If you've ever looked at your own life and wondered when it became something you were maintaining rather than living, if you've ever felt underestimated in ways that were invisible but cumulative, then you'll understand why this story needed to be told this way. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever sensed that the version of your relationship other people see is not the one you actually live inside? To most people, I was easy to define. I was the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who never makes things complicated. At dinners, I was the woman who smiled while others debated. At work events, I was the partner who remembered names, followed up, smoothed edges. In my marriage, I was described, often publicly, as grounded, supportive, steady, the kind of person you could build a life around without having to look too closely at how she was holding it all together. None of these descriptions was inaccurate. They were incomplete. I learned early that being low friction made rooms more comfortable. I learned that listening gave me access to information other people dismissed as unimportant. And I learned that when you don't compete for attention, people assume you don't need anything. My husband used to say I was the strong, silent type, half joking, as if it were a charming quirk. What he didn't realize, or maybe didn't need to, was that my silence was rarely emptiness. It was processing, cataloging, connecting dots. But to them, to friends, family, even to him, I was predictable, dependable, permanently available in the background of their lives. When people talked about our relationship, they talked about how balanced we were, how stable, how we never fought. That last part always landed strangely with me, not because it wasn't true, but because it implied something healthy that wasn't actually happening. We didn't fight because fighting requires engagement. I was the one who adapted, the one who adjusted expectations quietly, the one who noticed when conversations shortened, when eye contact became optional, and when decisions were made adjacent to me instead of with me. I absorbed those changes without announcing them. And because I didn't react the way stories tell women to react, no one thought anything was wrong. At social gatherings, my husband spoke about us as a unit, our plans, our trips, our future, while I nodded along, filling in details when asked. Online, our photos looked curated but effortless. Captions spoke of partnership, timing, and alignment. People commented things like relationship goals and you two just make sense. What they didn't see was how often I learned about those plans the same way everyone else did, through implication, not invitation. I was present without being centered, included without being consulted, valued but not quite regarded. And the thing about being underestimated is that it rarely feels like an insult at first. It feels like relief, like being spared from scrutiny. You tell yourself you're choosing peace. You tell yourself that not every moment needs to be negotiated. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid to speak, but because I was taught, subtly, consistently, that my silence kept things running smoothly. To them, I was reliable, emotionally low cost, someone who would always understand. They didn't notice how much I was understanding alone. They didn't notice that when you're always the one accommodating, people stop asking what you want. They stop checking in. They stop seeing you as someone whose inner world might be shifting. I wasn't invisible, not exactly. I was visible in ways that were useful. And that distinction between being seen and being used took a long time to crystallize. At this stage of the story, I didn't yet think of myself as someone being diminished. I thought I was being mature, balanced, evolved. I believed that if something truly mattered, it would be addressed naturally. I didn't yet understand that silence, when it's expected of you, is not neutrality, it's a role. And roles, once assigned, are very hard to step out of, unless you're willing to let the entire structure that depends on them begin to wobble. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the strange thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with enough force to demand a response. They pass through you quietly, and if you're not paying attention, you adjust around them without realizing you've been altered. We were at a friend's birthday dinner, nothing formal, a long table, shared plates, the kind of evening that was meant to feel easy. Someone asked how we decided to move forward with a project my husband had been talking about online for weeks. He answered without looking at me. He spoke about what we had decided, what we thought was best, while narrating a version of events I had never been part of. I remember waiting for the pause, the natural moment where he would turn and say, "Right?" or "What do you think?" It didn't come. The conversation flowed on, and no one noticed that the story included me only grammatically. I smiled. I nodded. I even filled in a small detail when someone asked a follow-up question. And just like that, the moment sealed itself as something unremarkable. On the drive home, I considered mentioning it, not confrontationally, just lightly. A "hey, I didn't realize we'd decided that" kind of comment. But I didn't want to seem petty. I didn't want to derail a good night over what could easily be framed as miscommunication. So I told myself a familiar story. It wasn't intentional. He probably assumed we were aligned. It's not a big deal. That rationalization was quick, efficient, almost automatic. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was how sharply I'd felt the absence of acknowledgement. Not disagreement, not disrespect in the obvious sense, just erasure so casual it barely registered as an act. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. He would reference plans in conversations that had never happened, speak confidently about preferences I hadn't voiced, post captions online that implied shared enthusiasm where there had been silence at home. When I asked carefully, he brushed it off. "You didn't object," he said once, smiling, as if that settled it. "I figured you were fine with it." And I was, in the way that people are fine when they've learned that pushing back costs more energy than letting things slide. The thing is, everyone else saw nothing wrong. Friends laughed. Family praised how in sync we were. The narrative was smooth, polished. No friction points for outsiders to catch on. So I did what many quiet people do when the room keeps moving. I adapted internally. I paid closer attention. I started noticing how often decisions were narrated rather than discussed. How often my agreement was assumed because my disagreement had never been invited. I noticed how easily my silence was translated into consent. Still, I didn't label it as a problem. Labeling requires certainty, and certainty felt too dramatic for something that left no visible bruise. I told myself this was what long-term relationships looked like. Fluid, efficient, less focused on constant check-ins. But something had shifted. Not in our dynamic, at least not outwardly. The shift was in me. I stopped offering input unless asked. I answered questions directly, without elaboration, not as punishment, more as a quiet experiment. I wanted to see if anyone would notice the absence of my voluntary engagement. No one did. That realization didn't hurt in a cinematic way. It settled instead, like a low-grade pressure behind the eyes. a dull awareness that something essential had been reduced to background noise. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar immediately. It simply taught me something I couldn't unlearn. That being easy to live with can sometimes mean being easy to overlook, and that the line between the two is thinner than we like to believe. After the first small cut, the others didn't feel new. They felt familiar. That's how normalization works. Once your internal baseline shifts, what would have startled you before becomes something you step around without thinking. The moments didn't escalate dramatically. They repeated, softly, consistently, in ways that were easy to explain away one at a time. My husband began referring to things as already handled when I asked questions. Decisions about timing, about money, about social commitments were framed as conclusions rather than conversations. Not secretive, just final. If I hesitated, he interpreted it as a delay, not dissent. "We can talk about it later," he'd say, which usually meant it would be discussed only if it became inconvenient not to. And I let that happen. I told myself that pushing for every detail would make it difficult, that being adaptable was a form of generosity. Those relationships require trust, and trust sometimes means letting go of control. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't letting go of control. I was surrendering participation. There's a subtle difference between compromise and omission. Compromise happens in dialogue. Omission happens in silence. And silence, once it becomes habitual, starts to feel like the safest option, even when it costs you visibility. Online, our image continued to sharpen. Photos from trips I'd experienced mostly through logistics rather than presence. Posts celebrating milestones I'd been informed of after the fact. Comments praising how solid we were, how lucky he was to have someone so supportive. Supportive became the word people used when they meant compliant. Offline, the space between us grew quieter, not tense, empty. We coexisted efficiently, we shared schedules, we updated each other on practical matters. We didn't speak about anything that required mutual vulnerability. When I did attempt to bring something up, my sense of distance, my confusion about certain decisions, he listened with half attention, nodding in ways that signaled resolution without reflection. He wasn't cruel. That would have been easier to name. He was simply uninterested in adjusting a dynamic that worked so well for him. And because he wasn't overtly dismissive, I felt unreasonable for feeling dismissed. So I rationalized. I told myself this was a season in which his focus was elsewhere, that I was strong enough to hold the emotional weight without needing constant reassurance. I framed my endurance as maturity. I also began editing myself. I stopped mentioning things that felt small but cumulative. I chose not to correct narratives in public. I smiled through comments that subtly minimized my role. Each time I did this, the choice felt inconsequential. Together, they formed a pattern. The most unsettling part was how invisible the pattern was to everyone else, including me at first. From the outside, nothing was wrong. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic withdrawal. But internally, I was shrinking the space I occupied in my own life. I became efficient with my emotions. I processed disappointment quickly, privately, and without witnesses. I told myself that naming discomfort wouldn't change anything, so why risk disrupting the surface calm? What I didn't yet understand was that calm, when it's one-sided, is not peace. It's compliance dressed up as stability. There were moments, small, fleeting, when I felt a flicker of resentment. Not toward him exactly, but toward myself, for how quickly I'd learned to disappear without being asked. I would notice it when someone else interrupted me mid-sentence, and I let them finish, or when a decision was announced, and I nodded automatically, or when a caption went up online that described a version of me that felt increasingly fictional. Still, I didn't resist. Resistance would have required acknowledging that something fundamental was wrong, and acknowledging that would have meant admitting that my silence was no longer a choice. It was an expectation, so I normalized it. I told myself this was what it meant to be supportive, that love wasn't about being centered, but about being steady, that not every thought needed airtime. And in doing so, I unknowingly trained the people around me, including the person closest to me, to see my quiet as agreement, my patience as permission. By the time I realized that, the dynamic had already hardened into something that felt difficult to challenge without seeming like I was changing the rules mid-game. I didn't yet know how to change it, but I was beginning to understand that if I didn't, it would continue, smoothly, politely, and at my expense. Roles are rarely announced. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you're going to be for us." There was no formal agreement, no conscious decision on my part, to accept less presence in exchange for less conflict. The role I stepped into formed gradually, shaped by repetition and rewarded by smooth outcomes. I became the reliable one, the person who would adjust her schedule without complaint, the one who remembered birthdays, followed through on commitments, smoothed over awkward moments. I was the emotional buffer between my husband and the world, absorbing stress so it never had to reach him. People trusted me because I was consistent. They leaned on me because I didn't push back. And over time, consistency turned into expectation. In my marriage, this role became especially clear. I was the partner who handled logistics, emotional labor, and social continuity. I was present at events, supportive in conversations, and accommodating in decisions. I made things easier. And because I made things easier, my presence became interchangeable. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being too competent. When you handle things quietly, people stop noticing that they're being handled at all. They stop seeing effort. They only see the outcome. At some point, my husband stopped asking if I was okay with things. Not out of malice, but out of assumption. I had never given him a reason to think otherwise. The role I occupied didn't require desire or curiosity from him. It required reliability, and I delivered that so consistently that it replaced the need for engagement. Online, this role translated perfectly. I was the composed partner in the photos, the supportive presence in captions, the quiet strength behind the scenes. People praised him for finding someone like me, as if I were a stabilizing asset rather than a person. I let that slide too. Correcting it would have meant challenging the narrative. It would have meant asking to be seen in ways that might disrupt the image everyone seemed invested in maintaining. And at that time, I wasn't ready to do that. I told myself the role wasn't entirely false. I was reliable. I was capable. I did care about harmony. But what I didn't acknowledge was how narrow the role had become. There was no room in it for uncertainty, or desire, or dissent. I wasn't allowed to be conflicted or evolving or unsure. The role required me to be steady at all times, predictable, low friction. And when you live inside a role long enough, it starts to shape how others interact with you. Conversations simplify, expectations flatten, depth gets replaced with function. I noticed it in small ways. People are asking me to handle things without checking my availability. My husband is speaking about future plans, as if they were already set. Friends assumed I would always be fine with whatever arrangement worked best for everyone else. No one asked me what I wanted, because the role didn't include wanting. It included supporting. The unsettling realization wasn't that I'd been miscast. It was that I'd helped write the script. By staying quiet. By being adaptable. By valuing smoothness over presence. At this stage, I still didn't see myself as someone being wronged. I saw myself as someone being useful. And usefulness felt safer than visibility. But something inside me had begun to resist that framing. Not loudly, not emotionally, just a quiet awareness that the role I was playing no longer reflected the person I was becoming. I hadn't changed overnight. I'd grown. And the role hadn't grown with me. That tension between who I was and who I was expected to remain was becoming harder to ignore. I didn't yet know what I would do with it. But I knew this. Roles that benefit everyone else rarely dissolve on their own. And the longer you inhabit them, the more uncomfortable people become when you try to step out. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point, no dramatic reveal, no sentence that split my life into before and after. That's what surprised me most when I look back. The day everything changed looked like any other from the outside. It was a quiet afternoon. I was at home, alone, scrolling absent-mindedly while waiting for a call that had been postponed twice already. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that's supposed to feel peaceful, but didn't. A notification popped up, a post my husband had just shared, a photo of us from weeks earlier, smiling, well-lit, perfectly framed. The caption spoke about partnership, about building together, about gratitude for someone who always understands the vision. I stared at it longer than I needed to, because I didn't recognize the woman he was thanking, not because the image was false. The smile had been real, the moment had happened, but the meaning attached to it didn't match my lived experience. It was a summary written for an audience, not a reflection of our private reality. Offline, we didn't speak, not in any meaningful way. We exchanged information, schedules, logistics. There were no conversations about feelings, about direction, about the distance that had quietly expanded between us. I remember setting my phone down and sitting very still. And for the first time, I didn't rush to reinterpret what I felt into something more palatable. I didn't tell myself I was being sensitive. I didn't tell myself it was just social media. I didn't tell myself this was normal. I let the discomfort exist without explanation. That was the shift. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I realized I had been participating in something without fully consenting to it. A performance that benefited him, reassured others, and required my silence to remain convincing. I learned my marriage was a performance for social media. And the realization wasn't devastating, it was sobering. Performances have scripts. They have roles. They have an audience. And most importantly, they have an incentive to stay exactly as they are. I saw suddenly how carefully curated our public life was compared to how unexamined our private one had become. How easy it was to post intimacy instead of practicing it. How silence at home made space for eloquence online. What unsettled me wasn't that he posted. It was that he believed the post. That he thought describing us as aligned made it so. I noticed something else that day. Something subtle but important. I wasn't angry at him. I was detached. The emotional urgency that used to push me to explain, to clarify, to repair, it simply wasn't there. In its place was a calm awareness. This dynamic only works if I keep playing my part. And for the first time, I questioned whether I wanted to. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have kept me inside the same frame, reactive, explanatory, emotionally available on demand. Instead, I did something quieter. I paid attention. I began observing our interactions as if I were outside them. I noticed how often he spoke about us rather than to me, how decisions flowed in one direction, how my presence was assumed, not engaged, and I noticed how little resistance there would be if I stopped filling in the gaps. That realization didn't make me feel powerful, it made me feel free. Because once you see the structure clearly, you understand where your leverage actually is. Not in confrontation, not in emotional appeal, but in choice. That day didn't change anything externally. Dinner still happened. Messages were still exchanged. Posts continued. But internally, I stopped interpreting my silence as patience. I began to see it as potential, a resource I had been spending unconsciously. And once you realize something is a resource, you stop giving it away without intention. That was the day something shifted. Quietly, permanently. After that day, nothing about my behavior looked different to anyone else. That's important to understand. I didn't withdraw suddenly. I didn't announce boundaries or demand conversations. From the outside, I remained exactly who I had always been, calm, composed, cooperative. The difference was internal. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a habit formed from years of prioritizing ease over expression. Now, it was deliberate. I stopped filling conversational gaps. When my husband spoke in generalities about us, I didn't correct or supplement. I let his words stand on their own weight. When decisions were mentioned in passing, I acknowledged them without endorsement. A simple nod, a neutral response. No emotional investment. He mistook this for agreement. Most people do. Silence is easily confused with consent when it's what they're used to receiving. But something else was happening beneath the surface. I was reclaiming attention, not outwardly, but inwardly. I paid close attention to how often my presence was assumed, how rarely it was sought. I noticed how much of the emotional labor I had been performing without being asked. Remembering details, anticipating needs, softening edges. I began to pull back from those tasks, not dramatically, just enough to see what would happen. Very little did. He didn't ask why I stopped reminding him of things. He didn't notice when I stopped prompting conversations. The system adjusted around my absence with surprising ease. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already suspected. I was not being engaged. I was being relied upon. And reliance is comfortable. It doesn't provoke curiosity. It doesn't invite reciprocity. So I chose silence again and again, not as a shield, but as a mirror. I let him experience the version of me that existed when I wasn't actively maintaining the dynamic. No emotional cushioning, no preemptive understanding, not cold, just neutral. He began to speak more, to narrate, to fill the space I used to occupy. But the content didn't change. It remained performative, future-oriented, and abstract. He still didn't ask how I felt. I watched all of this without urgency, without the need to intervene. People often assume silence means passivity, that if you're not speaking, you're not acting. But silence can be strategic. It can create space for patterns to reveal themselves without interference. That's what mine did. I began documenting, not in any official sense, but mentally, tracking discrepancies between public narratives and private realities. not to weaponize them, but to understand the structure I was standing in. The more I observed, the clearer it became that my emotional availability had been the glue holding everything together. Without it, the image remained intact, but the substance thinned. And still no one noticed. Friends continued to comment on how strong I was, how supportive, how lucky he was. The irony didn't sting anymore. It clarified. Because strength, as they defined it, required my silence, my endurance, my absence from the center of the story. I didn't feel resentful. I felt focused. I understood now that confrontation would have given him an opportunity to adjust his behavior just enough to preserve the structure. A few conversations, a few gestures, just enough engagement to keep me invested. I wasn't interested in maintaining the structure anymore. Silence, chosen consciously, gave me something confrontation never had. Time. Time to see whether the dynamic could survive without my constant input. Time to assess what I actually wanted, separate from what I had been conditioned to accept. And time to prepare, quietly, for outcomes that didn't require anyone else's permission. He continued as before, confident in the stability of something he had never had to examine. I continued differently, calm, observant, no longer expending energy to be understood by someone who wasn't asking. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I used. Preparation rarely looks like preparation from the outside. There were no late nights, hunched over documents, no whispered phone calls, no sudden changes in routine. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they would have seen the same woman moving through the same days, responding the same way she always had. That was the advantage. When people believe they understand you, they stop paying attention. What they never noticed was how much mental space had opened up once I stopped managing everyone else's comfort. How much energy I had been spending quietly, constantly, on smoothing, anticipating, adjusting. Without that drain, my focus sharpened. I began by observing patterns more deliberately, not just emotional ones, but practical ones. Financial rhythms, decision-making habits, what was discussed publicly versus privately, what required my input, and what bypassed it entirely. I noticed how often my name was used to legitimize choices I hadn't made, how frequently we functioned as a rhetorical device rather than a reality. I noticed which systems depended on my silence to run smoothly, and I started documenting, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. I kept track of timelines, of conversations that never happened but were referenced later, of posts that implied shared enthusiasm, of commitments made on my behalf, not obsessively, methodically. At the same time, I began investing in myself in ways that were invisible to everyone else. I updated skills I hadn't needed in years, reconnected with professional contacts quietly, reviewed accounts, not with alarm, but with curiosity. There's a difference between preparing to escape and preparing to stand independently. I wasn't running from something. I was positioning myself so that no matter what happened, I wouldn't be negotiating from a place of dependency. I also paid attention to my own reactions, what no longer hurts, what no longer triggered the urge to explain, what felt neutral when it used to feel urgent. Those emotional shifts told me more than any external sign ever could. They told me I was no longer attached to the role I had been playing. And still no one noticed. My husband continued to move through life assuming stability. Friends continued to praise our dynamic. Family commented on how calm I seemed. Calmness is often mistaken for contentment. In reality, it was a focus. I stopped volunteering information about my inner world, not as withholding, but as discernment. I didn't need to narrate my thinking for it to be valid. Instead, I asked myself questions I had avoided before. What would my life look like if I weren't optimizing for harmony? What would I choose if I weren't trying to be easy? What was I actually responsible for? And what had I simply absorbed over time? The answers didn't arrive dramatically. They accumulated. I realized that much of what I had been tolerating wasn't overt harm. It was misalignment sustained by my cooperation. And misalignment doesn't correct itself just because one person becomes more patient. It corrects itself when someone stops compensating. I also realized something else, something unexpectedly grounding. I wasn't angry. Anger would have pushed me toward reaction, toward confrontation, toward making myself legible to someone who had benefited from not understanding me. Instead, I felt precise. Clarity has a texture. It's quiet. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need validation. I continued to show up, continued to be polite, continued to live inside the structure as it existed, while quietly ensuring I was no longer dependent on it remaining intact. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the point. Because the most significant shifts often happen long before anyone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer stable. And by the time they do, the person they thought they understood is already standing somewhere else, calm, prepared, and no longer asking for permission. The reveal didn't come from a confrontation. It came from a quiet afternoon and a realization so ordinary it almost felt anticlimactic. I was reviewing documents I hadn't looked at closely in years, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because clarity had become a habit. I wanted to understand the architecture of my own life, the structures I was living inside, the ones I had helped build, and the ones I had simply adapted to. That's when I saw it, not a secret exactly, more like a pattern that only becomes visible when you stop assuming good faith as a substitute for transparency. My husband had positioned our lives in a very particular way. Publicly shared milestones, narrated decisions, framed progress as mutual. But beneath that, the actual distribution of responsibility, credit, and risk was uneven, and the imbalance favored him. Financially, legally, reputationally, things had been arranged for efficiency, not equity, not maliciously, not even consciously perhaps, but consistently. I had trusted the system because I trusted the person. I hadn't questioned structures because I believed in alignment. What I realized that day was that alignment had been assumed, not maintained. The leverage wasn't dramatic, it wasn't scandalous. It didn't involve exposure or embarrassment. It was structural. I understood suddenly how much of the stability he relied on existed because I had chosen not to disrupt it. How many systems depended on my cooperation, my credibility, my quiet reinforcement. And I understood something else. I could withdraw that reinforcement without confrontation. That was the private reveal. Not that I had been deceived, but that I had been over-contributing to a structure that no longer reflected my values or needs. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of vindication, just a calm, almost clinical clarity. This was the point where many stories turned toward revenge, toward exposure, toward a dramatic reclaiming of power. Mine didn't, because power, real power, doesn't need witnesses. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized. Not friends, not family, not even myself out loud. I let the knowledge settle quietly, like a new gravity. I adjusted how I moved within the system. Not abruptly, just enough to test where resistance would appear. It didn't. That told me everything. I saw how easily things continued without my emotional investment. How little curiosity there was about my internal state. How much confidence he had in a stability he didn't have to maintain. And I saw how much choice I actually had. The reveal wasn't about what he had done. It was about what I no longer needed to do. I didn't need to explain myself to be justified. I didn't need to argue to be right. I didn't need to be seen to be decisive. I just needed to act in alignment with what I now understood. That understanding came with responsibility, not to punish, but to choose carefully. Because once you see leverage clearly, how you use it says more about you than about anyone else. I chose restraint, not out of fear, but out of precision. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in ending a dynamic. And endings don't require noise, they require resolve. The private reveal marked the moment I stopped hoping for change and started preparing for the outcome. Not because I wanted to leave immediately, not because I wanted to stay, but because I wanted to be ready for whatever clarity demanded next. And clarity, once it arrives, never asks politely. Once you see the full shape of a situation, indecision becomes its own kind of action. That was the space I found myself in, not panicked, not rushed, but aware that continuing exactly as before was no longer neutral. It was a choice, one I would be accountable for. I didn't dramatize the moment. There was no internal monologue filled with ultimatums. Instead, I laid out the options the way I would approach any serious decision, calmly, privately, without romanticizing any outcome. I could stay and renegotiate the dynamic. That option looked reasonable on the surface. A conversation, a reset, a request to be more included, more consulted, more seen. I imagined how that might go. The initial surprise, the performative remorse, the short-term adjustment. I also imagined the long-term reality. Change that comes only after leverage is revealed rarely lasts. It becomes conditional, monitored, resented. And more importantly, it would require me to explain myself to someone who hadn't been curious when curiosity would have mattered. That option asked me to re-enter the same frame, just with better boundaries. I could stay and accept the role fully. This option was the quietest. No disruption, no conflict. I would continue to be reliable, supportive, and low friction, just with clearer internal expectations. I would know what the relationship was and stop wanting it to be something else. Many people choose this path. It offers stability, predictability, a kind of emotional economy, but it also required something I no longer had: the willingness to shrink. I had already outgrown the role. Stepping back into it knowingly would have been a kind of self-betrayal. The third option was the one I didn't rush toward, but couldn't ignore. I could leave, not abruptly, not emotionally, not as an act of escape, but as a decision made from clarity rather than exhaustion. This option didn't promise ease. It didn't guarantee approval. It didn't come with a ready-made narrative that others would understand immediately. But it did offer alignment. What made the decision irreversible wasn't anger or hurt. It was the absence of illusion. I no longer believed that staying quiet would eventually lead to being seen. I no longer believed that explaining myself would create mutual understanding. And I no longer believed that endurance was the same thing as love. That's the moment when decisions stop being hypothetical. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't seek validation. I simply stopped considering outcomes that required me to continue compensating for someone else's lack of engagement. That was the choice. Don't leave now or stay forever, but act only in ways that don't require my disappearance. Once that boundary was set internally, everything else became procedural. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, clean, almost mundane. And that's how you know it's real. Because real decisions don't feel like emotional explosions. They feel like the removal of noise. I slept well that night, not because the future was certain, but because I had stopped negotiating with a version of myself that was no longer willing to accept less than full presence. From that point on, every action I took followed naturally. There was no second guessing, no oscillation between guilt and resolve. The choice had already been made. All that remained was execution. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to explain it to anyone. That surprised me. I had always been someone who articulated her reasoning clearly, who believed that if people understood my intentions, things would go more smoothly. But this wasn't a decision that needed consensus. It needed precision. So I moved quietly, not secretly, just selectively. I began handling practical matters the way I handled everything else now, calmly, methodically, without emotional commentary. I scheduled consultations under the guise of routine check-ins, reviewed documents as part of organizing, adjusted accounts in ways that looked like standard maintenance. Nothing sudden, nothing alarming. If my husband noticed, he didn't mention it. From his perspective, the structure of our life was stable. Bills were paid. Social commitments were met. Online presence remained consistent. Offline, we still didn't speak. Not about anything that mattered. And because there was no visible conflict, there was no reason for him to be alert. People don't look for exits in rooms they believe are secure. I was careful not to change my demeanor. I didn't grow colder. I didn't withdraw affection in a way that could be labeled. I simply stopped offering what had never been reciprocated. I let conversations end where they naturally ended. I let assumptions stand without correction. I allowed plans to be narrated without my emotional endorsement. That was the quiet part no one noticed. At the same time, I was building redundancy into my life. Financial independence where there had been shared convenience. Professional continuity where there had been an assumption. Personal routines that didn't revolve around accommodating someone else's schedule. Each step was small, individually insignificant. Together, they shifted the balance. What struck me most during this period was how little resistance there was. No questions, no concern, no curiosity. The absence of inquiry confirmed what I already knew. My presence had been functional, not relational. As long as the function continued, the system didn't care how I felt inside it. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me efficient. I wasn't dismantling anything out of spite. I was preparing for a reality in which I didn't have to negotiate my own visibility. And I was careful about timing. Silence gives you time to choose when and how change becomes visible. It prevents premature reactions. It keeps the focus on the outcome rather than emotion. People often imagine that moving on requires dramatic gestures. It doesn't. It requires follow-through. I followed through quietly. I didn't rush to define the future. I just ensured that whatever future unfolded, I would not be cornered by dependency or guilt. Meanwhile, life went on as usual for everyone else. Friends commented on how grounded I seemed. My husband continued to plan ahead, confident in a partnership that existed mostly in theory. Social media reflected continuity, stability, and alignment. The performance didn't falter, because performances can continue long after the actors stop believing in them. What no one noticed was that I had stopped anchoring myself to the outcome. I wasn't waiting to see if he would change. I wasn't watching for signs of regret or awareness. I was acting as if my clarity was enough. And it was. By the time the consequences began to surface, everything that needed to be in place already was. That's the thing about moving in silence. By the time people realize something has shifted, the movement is already complete. The first consequences didn't look like consequences. They appeared as absences, small delays, missed handoffs, moments where things that used to just happen no longer did. Nothing broke dramatically. The system simply lost efficiency. My husband noticed this in fragments. A meeting that hadn't been scheduled, a social obligation that required follow-up, he wasn't used to handling. Details he had assumed would be managed without his involvement. At first, he attributed it to busyness, to timing, to external factors. I didn't correct him. I responded when asked. I clarified when necessary. But I no longer anticipated needs or closed loops that weren't mine to close. This wasn't withdrawal as punishment, it was alignment. When you stop compensating, other people feel the weight they didn't realize you were carrying. He began to feel that weight without understanding its source. There was a subtle change in his tone. Not concern, confusion, the kind that arises when a familiar system stops responding predictably. He asked questions framed as updates. Did we ever finalize that? I answered honestly. I don't think we discussed it. The phrasing mattered. Not accusatory, not defensive, just factual. Those moments unsettled him more than confrontation ever could have. They disrupted the narrative that we were always aligned without revealing why. Friends began to notice too. Not in what they said, but in how they adjusted. Invitations came with more explicit logistics. Assumptions were replaced with clarifications. The invisible labor I had been performing had shaped their expectations. Without it, they had to engage more directly. No one named the shift. They just adapted. What surprised me was how quickly the discomfort appeared once my contribution became visible by its absence. Not dramatic discomfort, just friction. And friction, when you're used to ease, feels like loss. My husband began filling the silence with more narration, talking about plans, about future direction, about us. But the tone had changed. There was an edge of uncertainty beneath the confidence. He still didn't ask how I felt. He asked if things were okay. That question came late. When I answered, I didn't reassure him the way I used to. I didn't smooth the moment or translate my internal state into something digestible. I'm fine, I said, meaning it in a way that didn't require elaboration. He accepted that answer because it fit the role he still believed I occupied. But something had shifted. The performance was losing cohesion. He began to experience the relationship as something that required maintenance rather than assumption. And because he had never learned how to maintain it emotionally, the gap became more noticeable. Still, there was no confrontation, just a growing awareness on his side that the structure he relied on was no longer self-sustaining, and on mine a quiet confirmation that I had been right to prepare before acting. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they arrive as inefficiencies, as discomfort, as the slow realization that something essential has been removed. I watched all of this with calm detachment, not because I didn't care, but because I had already done the caring. For years. Now I was watching the natural result of no longer overfunctioning, and I understood something important. The moment someone begins to feel loss is not the moment to explain yourself. It's the moment to stay grounded in the choice you've already made. By the time he realized something was wrong, the shape of the problem had already shifted. It wasn't that I hadn't given signs, I had simply stopped translating them. And without translation, he didn't know how to read what was happening. The first real attempt to fix things came disguised as concern. He asked if I was tired, if work had been stressful, if I needed a break. These questions weren't about us. They were about restoring function. I answered calmly, honestly, briefly. No, nothing was overwhelming. Yes, things were fine. No, I didn't need anything. That was the truth. What I needed, mutual presence, curiosity, engagement, wasn't something he knew how to offer now. And explaining it at this stage would have required me to reopen a dynamic I had already closed internally. He suggested small gestures, a dinner reservation, a weekend plan, things that looked like effort but required no structural change. I declined politely or accepted neutrally, without the enthusiasm that once carried those moments. Not to punish, simply because the gestures were arriving out of sequence. Repair only works when it begins before clarity becomes final. He couldn't sense that finality yet, but he felt the instability it caused. He grew more attentive in public, more performative online. The post became warmer. Captions are more reflective. It was as if he believed visibility could substitute for intimacy. But performances don't repair private absence. They only highlight it. Offline, we still didn't speak. Not about the distance, not about the future, not about what had been lost before it was acknowledged. He tried once to ask directly if something had changed. I paused before answering, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew how much to say. Yes, I said, only that. The silence that followed was heavy but not volatile. He waited for more, an explanation, a path back, a way to fix it. I didn't offer one, because at this point, explanation would have been a kindness I was no longer obligated to provide. The panic came quietly. He began checking in more often, asking logistical questions that didn't need asking, referencing shared history as if it could anchor the present. I listened, I responded, I remained composed. What he felt as urgency, I experienced as confirmation. The moment someone realizes too late that they've taken stability for granted is not the moment to renegotiate terms. It's the moment they learn what was required all along. And learning doesn't undo consequences. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't dismissive, I didn't withhold out of spite. I simply didn't reopen myself to a version of the relationship that depended on my emotional labor to function. That door had closed quietly, without ceremony. He asked if I was unhappy. I told him I was clear. That answer confused him more than anger would have. Unhappiness invites problem solving. Clarity does not. Clarity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't argue. It doesn't wait to be convinced. It just stands. By the time he understood that, it was already too late to fix it in the way he wanted to, because fixing it would have required him to go back, to notice the small cuts, the normalized disrespect, the role assignment, the silence that had once been reflexive and had become intentional. And that would have meant acknowledging how much he had benefited from not noticing sooner. Not everyone is willing to face that. I didn't ask him to. I simply stopped pretending it could be undone. The conversation everyone expects to be explosive rarely is. By the time we finally sat down to talk, really talk, there was no adrenaline left in me, no rehearsed arguments, no need to be understood at any cost. We were sitting at the same table where we'd shared countless efficient meals. The setting was familiar, the tone was not. He spoke first, not defensively, not angrily, just uncertain. He said he felt like he was losing me, but didn't know when it started. He asked if there was something specific he had done, something he could point to, correct, and fix. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I didn't rush to respond. Silence had taught me that pausing changes the gravity of a moment. I don't think there was one thing, I said. There were patterns. He nodded, waiting. I explained, not exhaustively, not emotionally, how those patterns had made me feel peripheral in my own life, how decisions had slowly become assumptions, how my silence had been mistaken for agreement. I didn't accuse. I didn't catalog every instance. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke as someone describing a system, not a grievance. He tried to apologize. I accepted the apology for what it was, but I didn't let it become the conclusion. I believe you didn't mean to, I said, but impact doesn't disappear because intention was absent. That was the moment the conversation changed. He realized I wasn't asking for reassurance. I wasn't seeking validation. I wasn't trying to be convinced to stay. I was informing him of a reality he hadn't noticed until it had solidified. He asked what I wanted now. The question came too late to feel like an invitation. It sounded like a contingency plan. I want alignment, I said, and I don't think we're aligned anymore. There was no argument after that, just quiet processing. He asked if we could work on it, if things could change. I told him honestly that a change would have required engagement much earlier, that what I needed now wasn't effort. It was a fundamental shift in how we related to each other. And I didn't know if that was something either of us wanted anymore. There were moments of sadness, of recognition, but no heat. Because anger requires proximity, and I had already stepped back far enough to see the situation clearly. He asked if I had been planning this. I told him I had been preparing myself. That distinction mattered. Planning implies a strategy against someone. Preparation implies responsibility for oneself. I wasn't dismantling his life, I was rebuilding mine. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic exit. No raised voices, no final words meant to wound. Just an understanding that something essential had ended long before we had the language to name it. And that understanding, once spoken aloud, didn't hurt. It relieved. I used to think transformation announced itself, that it arrived with confidence, clarity, and a visible shift that others could immediately recognize. What I've learned instead is that real change is often quiet and slightly disorienting at first. When the structure I had lived inside dissolved, there was no rush of freedom. There was space, unfilled time, unassigned roles, decisions that belonged to me without needing to be explained or justified. At first, that space felt unfamiliar, not empty, just unstructured. I noticed how often I reached instinctively for accommodation, for smoothing, for anticipating someone else's needs. Those habits don't disappear just because the environment changes. But I didn't rush to replace them. I let myself be undefined for a while. Who I am now is not a dramatic reinvention of who I was then. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I didn't swing toward bitterness or spectacle. I became more precise. I speak when I mean something. I pause when I don't. I no longer explain feelings to people who aren't curious about them. I still value calm, still value thoughtfulness, still value restraint. But I no longer confuse restraint with self-erasure. What changed most is how I relate to silence. Silence is no longer something I use to keep things running smoothly. It's something I use to check in with myself, to decide whether a situation is aligned or merely familiar. I don't perform partnership anymore. I practice presence. That means fewer assumptions, fewer unspoken contracts, fewer roles I didn't consciously choose. It means asking questions early, not to control outcomes, but to understand them. And it means walking away sooner, not from people, but from dynamics that depend on my quiet compliance. I'm no longer interested in being perceived as easy. I'm interested in being real. The irony is that nothing about my life looks radical from the outside. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't rewrite my identity publicly. If anything, I appear more grounded now than before. But internally, the difference is unmistakable. I know where my boundaries are because I've crossed them before. I know what disengagement feels like before it becomes resentment. And I know that clarity, once earned, is not something you bargain with. I don't regret my past self. She did what she knew how to do with the tools she had. She survived by being adaptable in environments that rewarded her silence. But I don't live there anymore. Now when someone describes me as calm, it's accurate, but incomplete in a different way. Calm is no longer the absence of reaction. It's the presence of choice. And when people underestimate me now, it doesn't register as a threat. It registers as information, because I know who I am when no one is watching. And that version of me no longer needs to be legible to be powerful. There's a lesson people often want from stories like this. They want a clear villain, a moment of victory, a visible reversal where power changes hands, and everyone knows it did. But that kind of ending belongs to a different story than the one I lived. What I learned didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with understanding. I learned that relationships don't usually break because of one great betrayal. They erode through small permissions given too often, through silence that slowly stops being a choice and starts being a requirement, through roles that feel harmless until you realize you've been living inside them longer than you recognize yourself. I learned that being low drama can sometimes mean being low visibility, and that visibility, in the wrong environment, costs more than silence ever did. Most of all, I learned that quiet people are not powerless. We are often the infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it withdraws, doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. This story wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own life. Emotional justice doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like no longer explaining yourself to someone who benefited from misunderstanding you. Sometimes it looks like leaving a role without making a scene. Sometimes it looks like letting consequences unfold naturally instead of rushing to soften them. And that kind of justice is quiet. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been praised for being easy, supportive, understanding, while feeling increasingly unseen, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not wrong for noticing. You are not dramatic for wanting reciprocity. You are not selfish for wanting to be included in your own life. Silence can be wisdom. It can be a restraint. But only when it's chosen, not when it's expected. The moment you realize your silence is holding something together that no longer deserves your effort, you're already closer to clarity than you think. And clarity doesn't demand action immediately. It asks for honesty, with yourself first. So I'll leave you with this, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. In your own life, where are you being valued for how well you adapt, instead of for who you actually are? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the quietest realizations are the ones we recognize in each other.